Hello, everyone. My name is Danny Petio. I am a staff attorney here with the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and I want to welcome you all today to our webinar on working with male survivors. Our presenters today are Sean Whiteman and Toby Frazier. Sean is a men's counselor and advocate for the bilingual domestic violence program at Lutheran Settlement House, whose work focuses on reaching men who are survivors of intimate partner violence. He has also experienced providing individual and group therapy to teens and adults with an emphasis on recovering from trauma and abuse. He received his master's degree in social work from the Smith School of Social Work. And also Toby Frazier, who is the manager for community education at Lutheran Settlement House. He has been a part of the movement to end intimate partner violence for the past 10 years. His work has ranged from doing workshops with youth about the roots of violence and social change to training professionals on concrete skills such as screening, safety planning, and supporting survivors. Just an FYI, we do have a jurist article on this topic available on PCADV's website as well for additional resources. At this time, I'm going to turn the presentation over to our presenters, Toby and Sean. Take it away, guys.
Hi. We wanted to get started by, first off, just getting a sense of where everyone is coming from. I know we have a lot of people here with us virtually in this webinar, and we really, we have a poll that we're going to put up in just a second. Lindsay, if you have a chance to do that, thank you. So you all can weigh in and give us an idea of, you know, what is your role, what kind of work do you do, where do you come from, so that we can sort of tailor some of what we're talking about today to those roles. And also so the other people here can get a sense of like who else is in this virtual room with you. And then I see some of you are already doing this, but like we're going to ask you in the chat box to tell us a little bit about kind of the literal room you're in right now, you know, sort of your surroundings where we're all in different places all over the state of Pennsylvania, right? We're in different rooms all tuned into this webinar. So giving us an idea of what's going on around you so we can kind of take a minute to notice that and then all kind of come together for the next hour and a half to really be together in this virtual space we're going to make and focus on that. Toby?
Yeah, so thanks again for participating. If you typed it into the chat box still, if you could click on the button in the poll just so everyone should be able to see the percentages now. So get a sense of who's here with us, see each other and the percentages there. And then we see some folks in offices. Feel free to weigh in. What's up around you? Is it noisy? Is it quiet? Are you alone? Is anyone here in a group? And also take a moment right now before we really dive in there and think about what's happening in your brain. Is there anything that's going on for you that's going to pull your attention away, make it difficult to participate? Just take a quick second while other folks are still completing the poll and typing in about their surroundings to jot down a note. Do what you need to do to make sure that you can be present with us for the next 85 minutes or so. So we'll give folks another 30 seconds or so to complete the poll and add in what's going on for you. Thanks again for participating in that.
Yeah, and having been to webinars, I know it can be easy to sort of like throw them on in the background and do something else, like maybe eat lunch, which we all need to do. We would like to make this as interactive as possible. We want to make good use of your time, and we want to sort of keep this moving along and also keep you all really involved in this process, especially because we're talking about, you know, working with male survivors is a topic that people can have some feelings about, you know. It's not uncontroversial sometimes. And we want to sort of stick together as a group and understand where people are at as much as possible as we talk about some of this stuff to get a sense of what your reaction is and how we can address any, you know, reactions or feelings you might be having as best we can in a webinar setup.
All right, so thanks again for participating in that. We just want to take one last moment to just welcome everyone from all over the state and how you're participating in this. So we see a few folks who are lawyers working at DHS, and then the vast majority of us work at domestic violence agencies. So welcome to all the advocates all the lawyers, all the different roles that you might fill at the agency that you work at. We also want to welcome in the feelings that you bring with you to this webinar, whether that's curiosity about what it could be, some excitement about talking about this. We also want to welcome in your skepticism. You're like, why would we do this? I don't understand the point of talking about male survivors because whatever, all the reasons that could come up there, right? Gender doesn't matter to me as much. I don't see male survivors as a real thing. I think survivors are survivors, so why would we have a special webinar just about men? If you have some skepticism, please bring that in. Feel free to throw it into the chat box or raise your hand if you played with that earlier, and we'll try and make sure to capture all of those things. We want to welcome in all the folks that believe that this is a need, whether you've been working with male survivors before or are going to start, still curious about it, trying to figure it out. So welcome in all the feelings that you might bring with you now and all the background that you have. We want to welcome in the experience to the room. We know a lot of folks here are from domestic violence agencies as well. So if you feel like something isn't quite right, strikes you as weird, definitely just let us know about that. And we want to invite you, like Sean said before, to participate. We're going to have a few of these polls up there. For those of you I saw who are in an office with a few other advocates, good luck deciding who gets to answer and how you agree on that or not. And also invite you to use the chat box like you are right now. So throw your questions in there. As we go along, Sean and I will each be taking turns. If one of us is talking, the other one will most likely be monitoring that chat box and able to respond as needed in there. Or if it's something that we feel like we need to bring up to everyone, we'll talk about it verbally like this. So welcome to everyone. Thanks so much again. So
what we're going to be doing, objectives, like here's a roadmap of where we're headed. So number one, we want to establish why work with men. Why is this important in the first place? Someone has already mentioned in the chat box, Celeste is saying, I'm seeing a lot more men filing PFAs. Yeah, that's real. Why work with men? Because they're filing more PFAs, because they're showing up in the legal system, they're showing up in courtrooms. We also want to look at the prevalence of IPV in men and women, dive into some of those statistics, and take a look at, kind of sift through those numbers and see, broken down by gender and broken down by types of abuse. What are men experiencing, and how is it different from what women are experiencing? Is it different? Next, take a look at some of the ways that a male survivor might present differently to, in your office, in a courtroom, in a judge's chambers, in a hearing. How are they going to show up differently? How are they going to look or sound? And what does that tell us about, how we can work with them best? We're going to talk about some of the barriers, the unique barriers that male survivors face. Internal barriers, like what stops them from recognizing or disclosing an abusive relationship, and also what are some of the external barriers, so even once they get to the point of being ready to say, like, I need help, what barriers stop them from, maybe getting the help that they're asking for. We're going to talk about privilege, power, and entitlement, because these things are real. And whenever we talk about, stigma or barriers that male survivors face, we want to, at the same time, not lose sight of the fact that male privilege is real. That continues happening even when a man is experiencing intimate partner violence. It's not like those things go away. So those things coexist, and we want to look at some of the ways that affects our work with men too, and some of the ways that we cope with those things when we're trying to work with them to, to sort of hold those two at the same time. Finally, we're going to talk about the difference between abuse and resistance. This is a tough topic that comes up a lot in working with any survivor, but in working with men in particular. We want to really dig down to the question of, in a relationship where there's, abusive dynamics or violence or sort of things going back and forth this way and that, how do we think really carefully and clearly about the difference between what is abusive behavior and what is a person who is resisting abuse? What makes those two things different so that we can understand that as professionals? All right.
Thanks, Sean. Awesome. So in Sean's role here at Lutheran Settlement House, he has a caseload of clients of all genders, including a good handful of men, and that caseload of men has been increasing since he started and has been doing some outreach work in Philadelphia about male survivors. So Sean is going to dive into a story of one of his clients. And while the story is going on, we want to invite folks to just pay attention and listen to it. And then when you think that the relationship you're hearing about is abusive, if it gets there, please just click now on the poll that should appear in a moment. So the slides will still be up and going with the client story. But then just when you hear a piece in the story that makes you think that's an abusive relationship now, just check now so we can get a sense of where folks are at around what is abuse.
Okay. So this is sort of like one of those like live buzzers in a game show. When you reach the moment where you're like, okay, this is abusive, like click that, use that poll like a buzzer and click in. And we are going to broadcast these results. I just clicked that so that they're live, so that all of you can see sort of when other folks in the audience, when you're listening, when other people kind of reach that point also. So this is the story of a client who I am currently working with. It's been anonymized for confidentiality, of course. The name we're going to use for this client is Jahn, J-A-H-N. He's a Liberian immigrant. He is 28 years old, came to the U.S. 2.5 years ago in order to marry someone who we're going to call Jane. It's an American citizen. She's an American citizen. They first met at this academic conference, started dating. Things got more serious, and she said, "Hey, why don't you come to the U.S.?" He wanted to immigrate at some point anyway. It was kind of in line with his career goals, as like long-term. He wanted to work in the medical field, either as a nurse or possibly as a doctor. He had already gotten a bachelor's degree in biology in Liberia, and he wanted to bring that over here and hopefully become a doctor. That was his dream. So things get serious, and he moves to the U.S. So Jane is from the Philadelphia area. She has really deep ties here, lots of friends and family. Jahn, at this point, he doesn't really know anyone. He talks to his family and people, his community, folks from where he's from. He keeps up with, Skype and that kind of thing. But like, he comes here and he's pretty much on his own, pretty isolated, which is, when we talk about abuse, isolation is one of those warning signs. It's one of those red flags, things that starts to, get my attention already when a person is pretty socially isolated. So they get married, and at first things are great. But pretty quickly after they get married, Jane starts really pressuring him about wanting to have a child, really kind of pushing him, it's like, let's have a baby, let's have a baby. He's hesitant about it. She starts really pushing him in a more assertive way, more maybe even aggressive way, pressuring him to have unprotected sex, throwing out condoms. At one point, she is kind of only half jokingly but pretty seriously pretending to sneak things like Viagra into his food, doing things that really, make him feel uncomfortable and like he doesn't really know what's going on. But she keeps telling him, it's normal for American couples to have unprotected sex, and it's really weird is the word she uses, that he's hesitant and, he should just kind of get with the program. So she also starts discouraging him from, and I want to just notice the fact that already so far, 18 folks have clicked that button to say now. So at this point, we've already got 18 audience members out there who are saying, this relationship is abusive. So thanks for using your buzzer. So at this point, she starts also discouraging him from pursuing what he kind of came to the U.S. to pursue, which was applying to medical school. She's saying, don't do that. Like, we have a baby now. It's your job to provide. You should be working. You should be earning a wage. That's what men do. That's what real men do. So discouraging him from kind of pursuing those programs. This is also when the fights start to get worse. and when they start to get louder, and when they start to go from, maybe conflict that's yelling to conflict that's more like screaming. Rage, insults, name-calling. This is also when Jane starts to, when there's conflict, she'll sometimes call her family members, who, remember, she's got a lot of, family members in the area. So she'll call, her brothers, and they'll start to call or text Jahn. They'll start to even come over in person to kind of yell at him, berate him. So that's starting to happen now too. And the number of people who feel this is abusive has now jumped up to 25. So Jane becomes pregnant, and she becomes really emotionally withdrawn. He's really confused by this, and she pretty much shuts him off at this point, and says, we can't even sleep together anymore. You have to sleep in the basement. There's some mildew and mold issues down there. He starts to have some health issues from sleeping there, but she says, look, this is what I need, and he sort of feels like, okay, I guess I should just go along with this. Their daughter is born, which is a really kind of a wonderful, joyful event in his life, but pretty quickly things start to change even more. So this is a couple months after their daughter's born. He goes into his wallet one day and sees that his green card is missing. He goes back home, says, hey, I can't find my green card, what's going on? Jane straight up tells him that she took it, she destroyed it, that he is really, she uses the word worthless. He's worthless to her. And this starts an argument where, for the first time, things get physical. They're yelling back and forth. She picks up a kind of a big glass ashtray, one of those heavy glass things, throws it at him, hits him in the face, and leaves him with a cut that he has to go to the hospital to get stitched up. He needs 3 stitches. And at this point, they're no longer living together. So after that, she tells him that he's got to get out. He starts sleeping on a friend's couch. If he tries to come over to what used to be his house, she calls her father or her brothers, and they show up pretty fast. They're nearby. They're in the neighborhood. And they start to get physically threatening with him, too. Anytime he shows up, they show up, too. Jahn calls the attorney that had been working on his immigration application, and he's informed that Jane had originally retained the attorney and gotten the process started for him, but she then, without telling him, called and canceled the whole process. So the immigration application that he thought was moving forward had actually been canceled months ago, before their daughter was even born. And he starts to get the sense that, like, this has been going on for a while, and this is actually, like, she's been planning this for a while. He starts to realize, like, things are really not what they seem. So that brings us up to the point pretty much when he came to seek services here at Lutheran Settlement House. I met with him as the men's counselor, did an intake. When we first started working together, it would have been about, I want to say, 3 months ago. So his daughter was 9 months old at the time. He really was almost never able to see her or be in touch with her. And anytime he tried to get in touch with Jane, she doesn't answer. And he starts pretty quickly receiving, like, threatening texts and phone calls from other family members saying, forget it, leave her alone. You're never going to see your daughter again. Just get used to it. Go home, leave, go back to Africa, go back, like, really pretty harsh, insulting things. So that's when he and I started working together in individual counseling to understand kind of what had just happened to him, and what he could do about it to start to, address some of the immigration issues, and heal from everything he had just been through.
Thanks for sharing that story, Sean, and for your work with him. I want folks to just take a moment, if you can, type into the chat box what sort of feelings did that story leave you with. and thinking about the poll that we did together. I see only about half of folks clicked now, and I'm curious if that is, and it's fine, if it's either lack of participation or if there are folks out there that would not identify that as an abusive relationship. So if that's your feeling, you're like, no, that's not really abusive, please throw that in the chat box as well, or private message us if you want to keep it anonymous. Yeah, so seeing about when she was using peer pressure and drugging him, that's when it started to be abusive. Thanks, Celeste. Yeah, so thinking about what constitutes abuse, and for Sean and I in doing this webinar with an eye towards the legal system, we wanted to offer out just a couple of different definitions, different ways of looking at what abuse is. So as we're noticing those poll results, we're going to move on to talk about different ways of thinking about abuse. And so we might talk about some of the things in the chat box. But for now, the thing up on the screen is the language for a PFA in Pennsylvania. This is as close as we wanted to come to a legal definition. Right, so for folks that aren't familiar, to get a protection from abuse, basically what they're looking for is physical violence, threat of physical violence, false imprisonment, or stalking. Those are the main thrusts of it. So a lot of the spots in the story, especially what we're seeing other people say as when I think it was abusive, wouldn't fall under that definition of receiving a PFA.
I heard, or I saw a few people in the chat box use that word disbelief, which I'm interested, Rashad, if you want to say more, Jen, if you want to say more, please, keep typing. We want to hear people's reaction and kind of understand where you're coming from about kind of what's behind that disbelief and help make that part of this conversation too.
Right. And understanding that disbelief is super real and can be complex, right? Is it disbelief as in, I can't believe something like that would happen, oh my gosh, or is it disbelief as in like, nope, that's not true, he must be lying, something like that. And definitely, Alexander, we're going to get into a lot of this, like what it means to be a man and how all of that stuff is going to come up into it. Before we move on from here, we want to invite folks to
next poll.
Do you think, after just hearing that story, do you think he would be granted a PFA? How likely do you think that is? That if Jahn had gone to court, he would get one? We see folks expressing, again, some of the disappointment in the ways that the systems can be used against people.
Yeah, and while you all take a moment to vote on that question of do you think it's likely that Jahn would be granted a PFA, I'll keep an eye on the chat box to see what else comes up for folks as you sort of like process that vignette and that client story.
Yeah. You see some likely. So we know with Jahn that he actually didn't even attempt to get a PFA, which is a choice that many survivors make for lots of reasons, right? Sometimes the protection from abuse order feels very supportive for people, and that's something that they want to try for. Sometimes they feel like, well, I'm not actually experiencing physical violence, just other types of abuse, so I wouldn't qualify for it anyway. Unfortunately, in Jahn's instance, Jane tried to get a PFA against him, and it's actually, although starts out negatively, ended well in that she was not granted that PFA, and reports from Shauna that that was a moment that he actually found some hope to say, oh, maybe someone would believe me. Maybe it's possible that other people could see this as abuse, and I'm not actually as alone as I feel.
Yeah, and Elizabeth asked a question that I want to answer out loud so everyone hears it. She asked, do we know Jane's race? In this case, Jane is a white woman. Didn't include that in the vignette, but it's true that, working with male survivors, we're not just working with gender, right? We're working with race, we're working with age, we're working with class and class privilege. So all of these things, all of these aspects of identity are, again, they're kind of happening all the time. And the way that, his story played out is certainly specific to his gender in some ways, but for sure, in working with him, like there are racial dynamics that come up too.
Thanks. And appreciating all the comments as well of saying that he should get one, deserves to get one. It's unfortunate that men aren't believed very often. And we know that's true for survivors across the board. Men definitely face some barriers that Sean's going to get into in a minute. But unfortunately, survivors in general aren't believed. So then when you add in any other barriers to it, it gets even worse. And definitely he would legally qualify for one, especially as someone commented, once he got stitches, right? So once it became physical or a serious threat of physical harm, a credible threat, he was definitely going to qualify for it. It's just, is it likely or not? We'll never know. So we want to broaden out that definition to something that I think probably most of us are more familiar with or use more often in our work, thinking about domestic violence or intimate partner violence as something that's about power and control. So not just about physical violence, but all the different other forms of violence that are out there. And specifically, not just something that happens one time, but it's a pattern of behavior. A pattern of behavior so that one person can have power and control over the other. So we're talking about all those things listed there, financial, emotional, verbal, all of that stuff. I'm guessing a couple people are familiar with this here. Power and control wheel is something that we talk about a lot in our work. Thanks to the folks in Duluth, Minnesota, and all of their interviews with survivors back in the day to really help develop this idea, the Duluth model, that abuse is about power and control. It's about that one person holding down the other one, having control over their life. We talk about it a lot of whose life is getting smaller, whose life is getting larger, who's allowed to move around and is leaving that relationship a safe option. A lot of those types of questions come into trying to determine who is the victim or survivor in this situation, what's going on in that relationship. So we have this power and control wheel, and what we wanted to do with it was map Jahn's story onto it somewhat to see what are the pieces of this framework that really land onto his relationship.
Yeah, because up until the point where that ashtray gets thrown and hits him in the eye, right, and physical assault has been committed, there's certainly a pattern of behavior, but nothing illegal has happened. So some quotations, some pieces of the sort of work that he and I have done together. Him hearing things like, what kind of man are you anyway? My family thinks nothing of you, right? So that piece of, using emotional abuse, sort of talking down to someone, belittling them, and in a particularly gendered way, right? Like, what kind of man are you? The moment when Jane is pushing him to be a provider, right? Go out and work. Like, don't go to school. Don't become a doctor. Go out and work. Become a provider. Sort of using gender stereotypes as a way to coerce someone, get them to do what you want. I'll call the police and tell them you hit me. This came up a lot, and this is something that Jahn was really terrified. He didn't understand necessarily sort of the legal system or the culture he was in some ways, but he knew as a black man, as an African man, he just had a sense of how vulnerable he really was. And that if at any moment, if Jane calls the police and they show up, they don't know what's going on, they don't know what's been going on, they just get, a snapshot of the moment. He felt truly terrified of what might happen to him, especially after his green card had been stolen. He did everything he could to prevent her from, calling the cops on him, because he felt like that would really be the end for him. So where that falls on the power and control wheel, right? Intimidation. That's an intense form of intimidation, using someone's race and gender and immigration status to really put the fear of the police in them. And that's a powerful level of coercion and control. She would say things like, you're such a baby, you make a big deal out of nothing. So again, this kind of, insult that has a kind of a gendered aspect to it. Don't be such a baby, which sort of means be more of a man. Eventually taking physical custody of their daughter and denying him access. So there's a part of the wheel that talks about using children, maintaining legal control over household finances, including joint assets. So she was the one who opened the mail. She was the one who paid the bills. She was the one who, because her English was a little bit better, she just took care of a lot of, those sorts of administrative things around the house. And when their relationship started to really change, that was another big source of, power and control. Discouraging him from going to school. So coercion, threats, isolation, don't do it. Don't become a doctor. Don't do what you were going to do. Do what I want you to do. Obviously, stealing the green card from his wallet, right? Canceling his immigration application, and then asking family and friends to harass and physically threaten him. So she's not sort of directly being violent after the ashtray incident, right? She's not being physically violent to him, but she has access to, family members who are willing to show up and sort of be intimidating and violent on her behalf. And again, that had just as much, in terms of the impact on him and the sort of fear and intimidation factor, having worked with, male and female survivors, he was absolutely just as terrified of what might happen to him, despite being a man, as any female survivor I've ever worked with who's experienced those same sorts of, intimidation or sort of stalking behaviors.
That I typically ask and didn't, but I see it coming up a lot in the chat box. In looking at the power and control wheel, this is something I'll do with groups all the time, is to ask folks to just take a second, reflect back on that, and how many of the things in the power and control wheel are actually illegal. So looking back at that, right, we'll see obviously the physical and sexual violence around the outside rim, that's illegal. But a lot of the stuff in the middle, a lot of the ways that we as domestic violence advocates view what abuse actually is, a lot of that stuff doesn't catch on the law at all. Not just in the legal definitions, but it's not going to be against other laws very frequently, unfortunately, which I think allows us a lot of space to organize, and not organize exactly to change the laws, but organize to understand the roots of violence and make violence unimaginable through seeing that the state and the system are not going to solve it for us, or currently aren't solving it, even with all of the information out there. So what can we do ourselves to change this dynamic, to make it so that power and control isn't something that's viewed as a benefit or a boon in our society like it is now, but it's something that we don't need over someone else to feel like an acceptable person anymore. Just want to note that because it came up a lot of like, why couldn't anyone, and what's likely and what's unlikely. So really seeing that and wanting to remember and feel into that. So we wanted to transition from talking about power and control and the definition of abuse to get into how often is this happening, right? We know it's happening since we know that most folks are DV advocates, I think all of us know that it happens to women quite a bit. We saw some comments earlier that, yeah, it probably happens to men more than we expect. So we want to just throw another poll up there and ask, well, how often do you expect it? So we're going to put one up that asks for, it's just a little fill in the blank. So we're going to ask you to write number, comma, number to fill in the blank. 1 out of blank women and 1 out of blank men will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. What's your guess? And again, over here on the poll, not so much in the chat box, what do you think are the lifetime? And this is across a lifetime, not just this year or last year or something like that. And we're talking U.S. specific are the statistics that we looked up. So you see the first answer is 4 and 9, 1 in 4 women, 1 in 9 men will experience it, 4 and 7, 3 and 6, 1 in 5 women, 1 in 7 men, 3 and 5 again, 4 and 8. So definitely folks are on the path, mostly putting it out there that women are experiencing it more, which is true. That's definitely what we're seeing. This is not a webinar about men experiencing violence more often than anyone else. That is not what we are saying at all. And yeah, you have a good one.
Yeah, I want to take a second to answer. Lauren asked a question, and I want to answer this one out loud because it's a great one. She asked, did any medical staff screen Jahn or ask him about abuse in his relationship when he got stitches for the ashtray? Unfortunately, the answer is no. That was a question I asked him too, and we talked through that. And that's going to come up again when we talk about barriers, right, and screening, and how, without meaning to, it's just really easy for providers not to screen men, particularly young men, for being a survivor of IPV, right? He went to the emergency room, they stitched him up, they sent him home, and it's not like any of the doctors were being negligent or, intentionally, right. It just didn't seem to occur to any of them to ask, like, hey, how did this happen? Like, oh, someone threw an ashtray at you? Like, wow, that sounds really scary. That sounds really violent. Those are questions that, when I work with providers around these issues, a lot of providers are hesitant. They're sort of like, wow, I don't know how a man's going to receive that question. Like, what if I insult him? What if, there's some hesitance on their part too to screen, because it's sort of like, well, I don't want to insult them, or what if they say yes? Then what do I do? So that'll come up more a little bit later when we talk about barriers, but that's a great question. Unfortunately, the answer is no, he wasn't screened. Would he have been screened if it were a different type of injury? Maybe, instead of just sort of, 3 stitches and an eyebrow. I don't know. But that is, for sure, that's a barrier that men face in terms of screening.
Yeah. And Elizabeth, definitely a barrier is for people, for anyone screening, whether or not they want to say yes. There's lots of barriers of, do I want to say yes because maybe they'll call the police or not? That's for sure for everyone. So yeah, there could be lots of reasons that the hospital decided not to screen. If it hopefully was an intentional choice, because then we can just say that's the wrong choice rather than not even thinking about it. It feels a lot scarier. And Sean, do you know, is he an English speaker?
He is.
Interpreter was the question that popped up.
Yeah, he is an English speaker. He speaks with somewhat heavy accent, but his English is good. All of our sessions have been in English, and every once in a while I have to ask him to repeat something, but we haven't had any trouble doing counseling in English.
Cool, thanks for that. So popping back over to stats, thanks. So we saw a lot of answers. Again, some of them are much closer together. Some folks seem to think that, maybe it's actually fairly similar, 1 in 3 women, 1 in 6 men, versus 1 in 6 women and 1 in 15 men, or 1 in 3 women to 1 in 15 men. So it definitely happens a lot more than that. And again, statistics are super tricky, depends on where they come from. The internet is a big, scary place, y'all. Who knows why people are putting out the work that they are. So we're going to go back to the slides now, and we have a few slides in a row from a CDC survey is where we decided to land on for what the stats look like that we prefer to use.
So I want to take just a minute. I won't spend too long on statistics, but I think it's helpful to use some good ones, even though a lot of you may be familiar with these. I want to talk about why they're good statistics, and I want to break them down a little bit by gender and by types of abuse to understand that, the CDC did a pretty good survey back in 2010, so I want to use those numbers. The reason we go to this survey is because, like Toby said, there's lots of different numbers floating around there. And people often use those statistics to make the point that they want to make when they have a particular agenda. We use these numbers from, you'll see there's a citation down there in the bottom right-hand corner. So this is the NISVS survey that the CDC did from 2010 to 2012. It's an interview-based survey. It's methodologically really sound. They talked to a lot of people, over 41,000 interviews over 3 years, right? About 23,000 women, about 19,000 men, and interviews were in both English and Spanish, so they tried to capture a pretty broad spectrum of the population. And they did about half and half landline and cell phone interviews. So they're trying to, again, reach as many people as possible. So it's a good survey, is the kind of the long and short of it. This first slide is about how widespread IPV is. About 1 in 4 women and about 1 in 9 men will experience IPV, and the thing that jumps out at me is, that this number makes it really clear that this is happening to a lot of people. Like, how widespread is IPV? Really widespread, really common. More common for women, for sure. Like, more than twice as many women are experiencing this as men. And at the same time, when you're talking about 1 in 9 men in the United States, that's a lot of men. So we're trying to sort of keep both of those things in mind as we go through this. So how severe is IPV? Also, for a lot of people, pretty severe. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have experienced what the CDC calls severe physical violence. And in case you can't read the sort of fine print, or it's hard to read at the bottom of the slide there, we're talking about being hit with a fist or something hard, kicked, hurt by pulling hair, slammed against something, or tried to hurt by choking, suffocation, being beaten, burned on purpose, using a knife or gun. We're talking about really severe violence, not name calling, like not a nasty argument, like severe violence. And it's worth noting that Jahn actually, he's one of those 1 in 7 men. That's his story too. I also want to break this down a little bit and look at these numbers more closely to get a sense of the types of abuse that we're talking about, because abuse is such a broad word, right? So one of those things, stalking, and this was part of his story too. So about 1 in 19 men experience stalking behavior. When we talk about sexual violence, that's about 7% of U.S. men report some kind of sexual violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Physical violence for men, that's just about 28%. In terms of specific types of physical violence, about a quarter of men in the U.S. are talking about being slapped, pushed, or shoved. And then finally, the report on psychological aggression really jumps out at me because, the power and control wheel, so much of it is about intimidation, using children, and in Jahn's story, so much of what happened to him up until the moment of physical violence, when that ashtray hit him in the head, was all the groundwork that had been laid, all those different forms of psychological aggression that he'd experienced in that relationship, all those red flags that, are sometimes harder to recognize when we're talking about male survivors. When I'm in an intake with someone or when I'm doing a phone screen, if I'm on the phone with a woman and she's saying, he really seems to want to have a baby. He's really pushing me, and I'm not sure about it, but seems to be really important to him. I'm already kind of thinking this sounds a little bit like reproductive coercion. There's already kind of a red flag being raised for me. When the genders are flipped, sometimes it's harder to do that. When Jahn is saying she really seemed to want to have a baby, she was really pushing, more than I expected. I didn't understand why. I try to pay attention to those sort of those moments when flipping the gender would make me really feel differently or think differently as a counselor or an advocate, and listening to the sort of moments of psychological aggression in a client's story. A lot of the time, that's what I'm listening for, that kind of larger pattern. So, again, what kinds of abuse? I highlighted the lifetime numbers over there on the left, and this is sort of a different way of visually seeing the same thing we were just talking about, that physical violence, being slapped, pushed, shoved, that's about a quarter of the violence we're talking about. Stalking behavior and sexual violence, not quite as common. But I highlighted the column that says estimated numbers of victims because I want to highlight the fact that even when we're talking about percentages that aren't huge or don't sound huge, it's sort of like, oh, well, 7% or 2.3%, that's not that many people. When you look at that as a share of the U.S. population, that means we're talking about millions or tens of millions of people. And I think that gets lost sometimes when the percentages are a little bit small. It's easier to dismiss, like a single-digit percentage. That still means we're talking about millions of people in the U.S. And those are the people that are, showing up in our offices, seeking services. Finally, one last note about coercive control, right? The CDC did a pretty good job of asking people if they've experienced that too. So this is sort of everything on the inside of the power and control wheel, right? Not the physical or sexual violence. And in men, 41.1% report experiencing some form of coercive control. That is almost 47 million men, and that is a big number, whether it's a percentage or a number of the population. That really jumped out at me because, so often we talk about sort of like DV or IPV is like when a man hits a woman, but coercive control is the groundwork that gets laid in the relationship for all of the abuse that comes later. So it really struck me that like when the CDC asked about that, about 40% of men were saying, yeah, I've experienced some form of that.
Mm-hmm. So as we get deeper to talking about what we mean by abuse and how often it happens, we want to dig into really the gray area and the messiness of that abuse versus resistance. Because we see it with survivors of any gender, and we see it as a lot of victim blaming that comes from the self, from survivors coming in and saying, it's my fault because I ... that involves some sort of fighting back, for instance. So we know that, right, it's not just the relationships out there are either healthy or they're abusive, and that's the end of the story. We know that in the middle there is an unhealthy relationship, and that spectrum gets really sloppy in between, right? When does it transition from healthy to unhealthy, and then where is the line from unhealthy to abusive? So definitely the legal system has drawn that line pretty clearly in saying it only exists from unhealthy to abusive if there's physical violence, threat thereof, stalking, false imprisonment, right, for the PFA language. As advocates, we know that it's not quite that clean. So we're talking about relationships. We can see that in a relationship, more than one person can be violent. That violence might be bidirectional, but abuse, we're going to say, is always one way. And again, leaning back into our definition of abuse involving power and control, saying that for it to be abuse, it has to be violence that's about gaining power and control, whereas resistance, while it might be violent, isn't about gaining power and control over someone else. It's about getting my own power back as a survivor. So while that might be bidirectional, only one person's perpetrating it. And then what we're talking about, the other one is resistance. Even if it's violent resistance, we're still naming that as a form of resistance, not abuse. So what we're really trying to figure out, and what Sean is doing a lot when he's doing intakes with anyone, but especially men, is deciding who has the power in this relationship itself, in this little subset. So what we have coming up next is a chart with very many words on it. So we're going to try and take it slow through here, and we've covered up most of it, and we'll just uncover it piece by piece. So looking at relationships, if we take gender out of the equation for the moment, what we see here is the column on the upper left talking about when someone is in coercive control over the other person. And then if you look down at the row going across, the top row is, and if they've used some sort of physical violence or non-physical aggression. So that would be the perpetrator of intimate partner violence, right? They have control over the other person, and they've used some sort of violence or physical aggression. If we uncover the next box, we have someone who's living underneath coercive control. So they are being controlled. They have less power in that relationship. And still on the top row is, but they've used some sort of physical or non-physical aggression. So we're calling that person a victim who's used some sort of violent resistance. So in the relationship from before, right, Jane is going to be the perpetrator of intimate partner violence, what was happening with Jahn. And Sean already mentioned that he didn't really fight back. He didn't push back very much out of that fear of a racist system, fear of being an immigrant in this country, especially right now, not wanting to lose all of that. So he wasn't fighting back. So he doesn't really fit this category. He's more down here in box number 3. So this is someone who's, pardon me, still living underneath coercive control, but they are only experiencing physical or non-physical violence. They're not perpetrating it as well. And then the last box, right, would be someone who's in control over somebody and is experiencing violence at the same time. So looking at those 4, the perpetrator and victim boxes, the person that's in the upper left and the lower right could be viewed as in a relationship, and that would be, in this case, Jane and John. And then if we look at the upper right and the lower left, those 2 people would be in a relationship with each other. So the victim that is fighting back in some way using some sort of violent resistance, but not in control over the other person. And then the perpetrator who is in control, but having violence enacted upon them, because we know that violence is definitely a thing that goes outside of what abuse looks like. So we try and use this when we're working with survivors of any gender to understand who is it that's the survivor here. And when people tell us like, oh, I've stabbed this person, or I've punched them, or I've yelled back at them, or I've opened their mail, or I've done a lot of those things that might be on that power and control wheel, trying to look at, well, what's the difference here? If someone was doing something within the power and control wheel from a survivor's perspective, are they doing it to keep themselves safe, right? There's lots of reasons that a survivor might say, even take some stalking type behaviors, right? Following their perpetrator around. But that's to stay safe, to know like, okay, this is what they're up to, this is who is sending them mail, and now I know I can make a leaving plan, for instance. I would need that information, or it would be beneficial. But it's not about making their life smaller, right? It's about keeping myself safe. So that's where it gets nice and messy. We try and use this chart and thank the folks over there in the UK at that website, respect.uk.net, for putting it out. So that we can really try and dig into what exactly is going on with this, and how do we decide who is a survivor and who is a primary aggressor in a relationship. So even understanding all of that, right, there's still going to be a lot of barriers for men to step forward, and some of that has been coming up already. So I want to invite Sean to jump back in and really talk about what are some of the barriers with the folks that you've been seeing and working with.
Yeah. So, like I mentioned earlier, we talk about barriers that are both internal and external. And to start with, the internal barriers, this question of what stops men from seeking help. Number one, they may not recognize that abuse is taking place. They may not just have the knowledge or the education to recognize that a relationship is becoming abusive, but it's not just unhealthy. It's not just like, I've got problems in my relationship, but that they're actually starting to occupy a position of really having no power, or being coerced or controlled in a way that's sort of chronic and ongoing and getting worse. This was definitely the case for the client we've been talking about, Jahn. It took him months to even get to the point of realizing sort of like, what's happening? Like, what's going on here? Even if men do recognize what's starting to go on, male ego is a real thing, right? And pride may prevent them from wanting to speak up. That's another internal barrier that we talk about, like pride as a barrier, something that stops men, even when it might be in their best interest, to speak up and ask for help. That's a big one. Men, in stereotypical terms, don't want to ask for help, even if they realize what's going on. Their own self-image as a man is often threatened by the idea that they are being abused. And that might just make it too uncomfortable to speak up and ask for help. We've talked a little bit about shame and stigma, and the sort of, shame as the internalized form of that stigma that a lot of the time is internally just too strong to overcome and stops men from asking for help. So when a man does decide, like, okay, it's time to ask for help, I'm in this abusive relationship, what are the external barriers? What stops them from getting help even when they ask for it? The big one, and this came up around screening, is often when they do speak up, they're either usually not screened in the first place, or if they do speak up and say, hey, I'm being hurt, I'm being abused, something's going on here, providers are less likely to screen, and friends and family they're less likely to ask if everything's okay, and more likely to be dismissive if a man does ask for help or try to disclose that something's going on. I had a session with this client this morning, and towards the end of it, we were reflecting on how far he had come, but also took a moment when he was thinking back to the beginning of our work together and when he was trying to tell his friends, like, what happened to him. And, the other young men he was talking to, and his other coworkers were just sort of like dismissive. Really, in general, like, whatever, man. Like, oh, she's probably just jealous, what's going on? Like, they kind of don't want to hear it. That's a barrier. So, beyond, skepticism from friends and family, right? Men who disclose and get involved with systems face a lot of skepticism from those systems, from police, from judges, sometimes DHS, family court, in the process of trying to get a PSA. And that's just the story that I hear over and over. And this is not to in any way badmouth or generalize about cops or judges or professionals of any type, right? Like, that's not my intention. And I can tell you that I've heard, it depends on who shows up, right? It depends on what judge, it depends on what cop. Often, the cops show up and it's sort of like, hey, look, you two, like, take a walk around the block, what's going on here, or the sort of, the skeptical authority figure. Skepticism it's a big barrier. And then on the sort of resource level, there are just fewer resources for men. The big example of that being that, of course, the city of Philadelphia has 2 confidential DV shelters for women and no DV shelter for men at this point. So men go into the sort of the city shelter system like any other homeless person. It's a reflection of the fact that the resources aren't there because often this isn't talked about because of a lot of those internal and external barriers. And finally, just to circle back to that CDC survey for 1 second, when they asked men and women about the consequences of IPV, of what they're going through in their relationships, sort of how is it affecting you? Not surprisingly, those answers really broke down along gender lines also. So take a quick look at this. They asked about 62% of women, only 18% of men reported feeling fearful. About the same number, so way more women than men, reported concern for their safety. And 52 versus 17% of women and men reported some sort of symptoms of what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder. So when they're asked how is it affecting you, maybe not surprisingly, men are overwhelmingly saying, it's not, or no, I'm not scared. I'm not scared for my safety. I don't have feelings of fear. I don't have these symptoms of PTSD. And, why would that be? What might stop men from sort of recognizing or reporting those things on a survey? Because certainly in doing individual counseling work with men, those feelings are there and those consequences are there overwhelmingly. In all of the work I've done with men, once we get past the sort of, initial presentation and into some of the real feelings and the effects of what's going on, these men are scared. These men are concerned for their safety, and that word safety might mean something different to them than it would mean to a female survivor. And they may not say, I have PTSD symptoms, but they certainly talk about nightmares. They talk about flashbacks. They talk about extreme anxiety, panic attacks. They talk about hypervigilance, all of the things that we would, listen to and say, yeah, that's post-traumatic stress. So one of the ways that the stuff doesn't necessarily show up on a survey when men are asked about it, for a lot of the same reasons we've been talking about, those internal barriers. But it certainly shows up in the work itself, in counseling and working with men.
Yeah. Pardon me. Thanks for that, Sean. So this next piece is going to get at some of what Celeste, you were just bringing up in the chat box. So the last point, just want to name that is very good point, very good catch. We've been having a very heteronormative conversation here, set up from the client vignette story that we decided to share about a man and a woman in a relationship. So of course, relationships cross gender in all sorts of different ways, and this presentation is about, or male survivors in general, will generally act and have similar barriers no matter who their partner is. We can definitely see the different barriers that come up for people around who are in the LGBT community, not wanting to both out themselves as a member of that community that still faces stigma and oppression and violence, as well as out themselves as a survivor of violence, as well as all the other things, right? Some of the barriers that were there for Jahn around potentially a little bit of language barrier, immigration status, all of that stuff. So definitely barriers fluctuate some and stay fairly similar. But thanks for pointing that out. And then this, right, is the man box. So I want to give a shout out to Paul Kibble from the Oakland Men's Project, that's now defunct, but was a big part of doing this work in the 80s and 90s for creating the man box, right, which is this idea of how men and boys are socialized. And you can do this for a women box as well. Unfortunately, one of the pieces of violence that comes from the man and woman box is that really there's only two. We know that people have very different genders than that, and they're not given options. They're not allowed to exist in the same ways that the rest of us are if we do identify in one of these boxes. But just to break down the image on the screen, that list on the left-hand side, men are exactly that, things that men are expected to be by our society, to be active, to be strong, to be the breadwinner, to make the money, all of that good stuff. The column on the right-hand side are just more stereotypes about men. Men aren't supposed to make mistakes. Definitely we don't cry, but of course we take charge and be strong and stoic and all of those things. We're supposed to know about sex, make the first move, right, all of that stuff. I'm guessing some of this might be familiar for folks. And then the things in the middle are feelings that I'll speak for myself, was taught to put some barriers around, right? Don't act or feel vulnerable or alone or powerless. Those weren't emotions that were allowed. They were off limits. And we can see that with survivors as well, of feeling like I shouldn't be feeling this. And because of a lack of emotional intelligence and education in our society right now, in this particular culture right now, we're not given access to those very much. So men are socialized into this box through all sorts of different things, right? Talking media, family, schools, and peers, that even if I was at home and was allowed to cry and express myself, as soon as I went to school, I very quickly learned that is not an option for a young boy, that I need to put those feelings aside, stuff them down, ignore them. And so that becomes a huge barrier for men, especially trying to figure out what does it look like if I am feeling vulnerable. And like Celeste was saying, I think earlier, if that's how I'm feeling, but I'm not allowed to show it, what do I do now, right? How can I let someone know that? It becomes another barrier for survivors to face.
Yeah, and I just want to point out that the feelings kind of in the middle of that box, confused, angry, scared, alone, powerless, vulnerable, those are the feelings. That's a description of what it feels like to be a survivor of intimate partner violence, period, of any gender, as a human being. Like, those we know really well are the emotions that come from that experience. And those are the emotions that men in general are socialized not to feel or to deny feeling. And in that context, it makes a lot more sense that when the CDC asks, what are the effects of IPV? What are the consequences for you? The answer is, not that much. I'm good.
I don't feel scared.
Yeah, let's move on. But those feelings do come up in counseling. Those feelings are there. They exist. They're real, and they come up in different spaces. Where there's room to express them. And obviously, that man box, that process of socialization, has a huge effect on the way that male survivors are going to show up in a courtroom, in our office, in these, professional or legal settings. So how do they show up? How does Jahn seem, when he's sitting at a custody hearing or a PFA hearing? The way that he described feeling was confused, angry, overwhelmed, powerless, a lot of those feelings we were just talking about. The way that he described acting, he has said, he felt like he just had to sit there and take it. He felt like he just had to be as stoic as possible. Some of these ideas come from, male socialization. Some of them are sort of culturally informed. He talked to me about what it means to be a man in Liberia. And not too surprisingly, male socialization, is real all over the world. Male ego exists all over the world. And his idea that he had learned growing up of how a man is supposed to act is the way that he tried to act in that courtroom. But that also makes him a little bit confusing for other professionals who are sort of, lawyers and judges and people trying to size him up in a courtroom and understand, is this person believable? Are they sympathetic? What's going on here? They just get that snapshot, right? They just get 5 or 10 minutes in an office or in a courtroom to make a ruling, to figure out what's going on here. And we want to point out that what's happening on the outside, on the exterior, on the face of any survivor, but in particular a male survivor, doesn't necessarily match up with what's happening on the inside. And it's important not to be thrown off by the way someone presents, by the way a male survivor presents in terms of gender presentation, and be thrown off by that. Sort of keep looking, keep asking as much as we can as professionals to try to notice our own blind spots and not make assumptions about what we think is going on. Well, that guy's just sitting there and his face is cold, he looks expressionless, he looks angry. Anger is a big one. It's sort of well, that guy looks angry, he couldn't possibly be going through an abusive relationship. Well, let's keep digging, let's stay curious and keep asking what's going on, and not be sort of thrown off by the way that male survivors sometimes show up, which a lot of the times has more to do with the way they feel like they're supposed to act or allowed to act, and not necessarily their story or how they're actually feeling or what they're going through.
And if you have worked with men a lot or a little, I'd love it if you could just throw a note into the chat box of what's a question that you like to ask, or what's a way that you approach a male survivor that you're interacting with to try and get past that public face that's shown to see what's beneath it. So whether it's something you say to them or do for yourself, if you do have something, we really want to invite the experience of the group to be shared with everyone else. So throw that into the chat box if you can. Now we just want to move on to something else that's super, super real, that doesn't disappear just because a man is experiencing intimate partner violence, which is power, privilege, and entitlement in society at large. So unfortunately, it's not just Liberia or just another country or just a particular religious group that socializes men to be dominant, to be in charge and in control and all of those things. We see that the world over, and especially here in the U.S. as well. So we understand and need to understand that when we're working with men, even if they're being abused in that relationship, they still benefit from male privilege at large, right? I think it's, as Sean put on the slide, just because you're experiencing IPV doesn't mean that the gender pay gap is going to disappear, right? So they're still talking about power and control. and thinking about who has more power than who. It might be in this relationship that the man has less power or no power, but then in society that could shift, which we've seen and heard as a reason for abuse to come up, as well as something that we then have to grapple with when we're working with a male survivor doing empowerment counseling of how do we empower you in this moment and in this relationship, but not build onto that sense of entitlement that you deserve to be in charge and have control all of the time. So it's going to be really tricky, especially for men that don't recognize that experience is happening for them, that don't see themselves as having male privilege. So trying to do the empowerment counseling while also pushing back on that and offering up that perspective. Another issue that will come up with this that I know Sean definitely deals with is that during sessions, a man might express and use some really misogynist or sexist language. And what do we do then? To say, okay, I hear what you're doing, I can see that you're feeling anger and that this is probably what you've been taught, how you've been taught to express that is through misogyny, but you're still a survivor. So how do we move forward in that way as well? And making sure to be careful and acknowledging of that.
Yeah, and so some of the ways this has come up, again, going back to Jahn's story, he has some ideas about women that I don't necessarily personally agree with. Some ideas about the proper role of a quote-unquote wife. And that's come up in our sessions together. And, the challenge there is to sort of, not necessarily, I've been able to work with him and not endorse those ideas, right? But also not let some of the things I'm hearing distract me from the facts of his story or from what's going on. And the challenge and the trick as professionals is to sort of do both at the same time, right? And not to fall into the trap of hearing something that rubs us the wrong way, or seeing someone who looks angry, or who says something that's like, well, that's an obnoxious thing to say, like that's sexist, that's misogynistic nonsense. It may be, and at the same time, that doesn't necessarily make someone a survivor or not a survivor, right? So sort of putting those things to one side and really listening for, again, for power, for coercion, for control, and kind of working with those aspects of a person's story without endorsing some of the other things that we may or may not personally agree with. And I think that, often we have to find ways to do that all the time. And that's true with male survivors too, We don't agree with every single person's opinion that we work with, but that doesn't stop us from working with them as survivors and as human beings.
Thanks for that.
Yeah. So
yeah, it's challenging, but here we go doing it. So we just want to offer up a couple things in closing for now before we open it up for other general questions. So start getting those ready, thinking about if there's anything you want to share with the group or ask. So I'll say when working with survivors of any gender, right, listening is so important. And we want to offer the idea of listening beneath the words exactly that are being said, especially when stuff might be confusing or unclear, and to think about how is this person talking? What are the emotions that are behind the words that they're saying or the stories that they're telling? Are they contemptuous of their partner? Do they think that this person is just a horrible monster and they just have no care for them? Or are they scared of them, right? And that doesn't mean it's super clear-cut in this instance, but it gives us, as we're doing this work and doing intakes, some insight into what's going on. If it's someone who's just feeling contempt for the other person, we're a little bit more nervous. But if they're feeling some fear, it feels a little bit easier to understand what might be going on in that relationship. We're also trying to look at what's happening over time in a relationship and to see whose life is getting smaller, like we talked about before, who's being controlled, who's being held down and not able to do stuff, who's being isolated in all the various ways that that could mean, versus whose life is not when they're explaining what's happening in the relationship and what that looks like. And then a shout out for over on the right-hand side of the screen, I think just under our little faces, there are a few files for download. There's a flyer that Sean made, Men in ITV, that has some specific language on it, some other ideas around screening questions and ways to talk to men. Below that, the one titled Working with Male Survivors is from the federal government. They're putting out some technical assistance guides around working with male survivors. We just met with the folks who authored this one a couple weeks ago and appreciated it. Think that they have a lot of good perspective to offer, so really want to encourage folks to check that out and read that. And then we have the slides as well, so feel free to download these. It has the little notes on the side if you want to make any notes of things that came up. We just want to end with something that our director says all the time. It helps us remember that survivors are survivors. That gender definitely matters, power and privilege is incredibly real, and at the end of the day, the thing that we're doing is survivor support. So we just want to remember that no matter how they're presenting, no matter what they look like, what gender they may be, survivors are survivors, and that's who we're believing and who we're working for. Go ahead.
Oh, and I just want to throw one last little pitch in there. In terms of resources, so of course you can get in touch with us, and we'll put our information in the chat box right now so that you have our email addresses. We included a flyer that I created available for download that has some quick tips on it, and that also has the Philadelphia hotline number on it, and the national number too. And we want to encourage people, remind folks that like those numbers, don't just have to be to hand out to survivors or people you are, concerned about or people who you think might be survivors. Those are information lines too. And like we're doing this work and questions come up all the time, every day. People, on the other end of those hotlines love it when other professionals call and just ask questions, ask sort of like for advice. Describe a scenario and say like, hey, I'm trying to work this out. I don't know what to do with this exactly. What do you think? That's a really useful way to, to use those hotline numbers for consultation for us too, not only as things to hand out to people who might be survivors.
And thanks so much, Lindsay, for all the help, technical and otherwise. This would have been much clunkier than even the bits that it was without Lindsay's help. So thanks for that and adding our email just now. Are there questions or comments, concerns, anything like that that someone wants to share, whether with us directly or with the group at large? Feel free to take a moment and type it in or raise your hand, and we'll try and understand how to work that piece of this technology.
Yeah. Hey. Oh, thanks.
We'll always take a compliment, and we have, 5-10 minutes left. So if there are things that folks want to get into, we'd love to hear about that as well.
Hey,
Sure.
Toby and Sean.
Yes, ma'am.
This is Lindsay. I just wanted to double check and make sure that if anybody is sitting in a room with others, we want to make sure that you get credit for this webinar. So please type into the chat anybody that you are sitting with in a room so you can, make sure you get credit.
Thanks.
And again, as I advised before, this webinar is recorded and this link will be available up on our website in 2 weeks. So I know a lot of people had signed up and were not able to come, or there were people that were not able to sign up at all. So, let them know that this link is going to be out in about 2 weeks. Thanks, guys.
And thanks, everyone, for your kind words. And I see some names popping up, so that's great. I'm glad folks will be able to get credit for being here with us. And Vashti usually just says those words, survivors are survivors, and then it's a much more open conversation after that.
Mm-hmm.
Talk more about addressing privilege with clients without disempowering them. Thanks, Nicole.
That's a great one. And that's a great question because it's tricky and because it sometimes means walking a little bit of a tightrope. So in individual counseling, what I'm doing is I'm trying to listen for parts of the story the person is telling me, to listen for power, coercion, and control, and to listen for entitlement, and sometimes aggrieved entitlement at the same time. and respond to one and not the other. So, addressing, sometimes that means sort of education with them as we're working together, sort of sifting through the story and understanding what they feel. They might feel like a certain thing is abuse or abusive. Well, they feel like it's abuse that, dinner's not on the table when they expect it. Well, we're going to talk about the fact that that's not abusive. That's a feeling of entitlement that they have, a certain expectation that they have, that they deserve a thing and they may not, as Toby said, they may not be getting it. That doesn't make them abused. That makes them upset about an expectation they have that's not being met. And in that case, we're not talking about abuse. We're talking about sort of an agreement in a relationship, an understanding of the way things are supposed to work, or the way they want things to work that's not working out. So that's a conversation that they can have with their significant other, and either come to an agreement or not. So that's something I would put on the side of sort of aggrieved entitlement, right? Often when they're describing things that are in fact abuse or abusive, they're not necessarily outraged about them because they may not even necessarily recognize them as abusive, They're just maybe describing the way finances work in their house, or, could be anything really. But I'm listening, again, for power and control and coercion. And so I would say it's sort of the challenge of listening for both things at the same time, and not necessarily responding just to what the client says, sort of like, well, I think this is abusive, That doesn't mean I don't believe them, right? Like, I believe every survivor who walks through the door, male or female, but we're going to sift through their story, and we're going to try to sift apart what is a sense of entitlement versus what behavior or feelings really come from issues of like power and coercion and control. And sometimes that's a challenge. Sometimes it's difficult, and sometimes I've worked with people who were in abusive relationships who really didn't necessarily realize it, and I've worked with people who really felt like they were in these abusive relationships and they're so angry, and in fact we get to the end of an intake and the answer is, you have a large sense of entitlement, but we don't necessarily hear abuse happening here, and maybe it's best for them to sort of like, they might get the best services from a different agency that works with folks who aren't survivors, but just aren't happy with the way their relationship is going. So,
yeah. A question about how do you handle the fluctuating emotions with a male survivor?
Let me see. Okay. The question is about fluctuating emotions?
Mm-hmm. Any tips on how to handle the fluctuating emotions of a male survivor?
Yeah, tips. I think reflecting the feelings they're having is big. Sometimes reacting to a story, often they're not having fluctuating feelings. Often they're having kind of no feelings at all, especially at first. And sometimes they need me to react in order to almost give them permission to have those feelings or to show those feelings. So if someone's describing, telling a story in a sort of a monotone, or like it's no big deal, which I hear a lot, just kind of like, oh, this happened, I guess that happened too, like whatever, no big deal. Sometimes it's my job to kind of react to that story in a way that is, kind of authentic to how I'm feeling in the moment. Of like, wow, really? And then that creates the space for them to, kind of display the feelings they're having, or makes it okay to have those feelings out loud or in the room.
Thanks for that, yeah. And I imagine, right, it's awesome to take the time out and talk about male survivors in particular and dig into all of those differences and the barriers and the privilege and on and on and on. And remembering that survivors are survivors and people are people as well in some ways. So thinking about what are the tips and tricks that you already use with survivors of any gender, and then do you actually need to make a change or not, right? And trying to toe that line somewhat. Not wanting to make it seem like anyone of any gender is this weird other species like we've been taught so much of our lives, or like I've been taught so much of my life in the pop culture of the U.S., but trying to think about just people are people, so emotions are real, they're there. There might be some barriers to getting there, but emotions are there. So the things that work with a woman might very well work with a man, or maybe it's just like a slight twist on the language. But yeah, it's a fun dance to try and negotiate with people.
Yeah, and Nicole, like you just said, it's a challenging balance. That's absolutely true. It's a challenging balance. It can feel a little bit like a tightrope, and we feel that walking it is important. That like both sides of the sort of the barriers are real, and power and privilege are real too. And keeping both of those present in the work are really important.
So thanks again, everyone. I see it. Maybe a couple other people are still typing, but Lindsay, do we have a humble conclusion of the webinar? I think folks are welcome to stay, and we can keep talking over the chat box.
I'm going to be getting going pretty soon because I am scheduled to meet with a client in a few minutes. But if there's any last questions, you can stick around for a minute, even though it's technically 1:30.
Yeah, and Sarah, good point. Yep, dealing with that on a higher level or high level of social pressure to not experience or express those emotions, rather. Ooh, a quick turnaround of emotions when talking about the legal system, and I'm guessing the lack of support there. Yeah, courthouses can be challenging. So.
Yeah, and a couple of these sort of questions and comments are highlighting the way that one of the, in terms of like disbelief and fluctuating emotions, one of the things that male survivors are sometimes dealing with is this sort of this shock at sort of being on the wrong end, the quote-unquote wrong end of this experience or this system, right? They sort of otherwise have this, dominant social identity, and they are suddenly having this typically sort of marginalized social experience. And that can create some emotional whiplash. It can really kind of get people turned around and shocked at sort of like, suddenly they feel disempowered, maybe for one of the first times. Suddenly they're in this position that is disempowered, that is vulnerable, that is confused. And we work with those feelings too, while trying to acknowledge that they may be feeling this way for the first time. Someone else with a different social identity, that may be the way that they go through the world. Sometimes male survivors finish the process of counseling with more empathy for others than they came in with. And that's, that's a real thing.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone, for participating. We appreciate you. Lindsay, what comes next?